We will move into informational items. Mr. O'Toole has a budget presentation for us this evening.
Good evening. So thank you. This budget presentation is rather close to what we presented last year and a lot of those slides, but I'll get started because it's got a little length to it. So please stop me at any moment in time if you have any questions. So the flow of this presentation is I'm going to start off with 2022 PSBA report. And the purpose of doing that is just showing the state of education in the state in Pennsylvania. From there, we'll move into benchmarking. How does MTSD compare to those like districts, as well as those in IU5? And then we will discuss where we anticipate ending this current fiscal year. Again, starting off, this is this 2022 State of Education report that PSBA submits. I literally just looked. They just submitted the 2023, but a lot of the information is rather comparable for what I'm looking at. This report is generated by both looking at AFRs that are submitted financial information to the state, as well as surveys for all 500 districts. That survey response rate was 55%. If you look at some of the main factors from the report itself is anticipated for this year as well as following year, staffing shortages. That's one of the highlights from the survey that came out, as well as teaching substitutes. Those are going to be challenges moving into next year. In addition to that is mandatory charter school tuition payments. Those are becoming more expensive on an annual basis. And we'll get into that in more details here as we go through the presentation. The pandemic had impacts on enrollment. As you can see down at the below graph on the far left-hand side, that it shows districts. And there was a decrease of 3.2% for districts on enrollment between 2019 and 2021. That is no different from whether the district resides in an urban environment, suburban environment, or a rural environment. Meanwhile, cyber charter school specifically, enrollment increased by 59.1%. And then the other large increase that you see on the far right-hand side was an increase of 59.5% for home education. So the pandemic did have an effect on enrollment. Looking at that in a little bit more detail by grade band, you can see here that whether it's K4 or K5 had a significant reduction in enrollment in the state of Pennsylvania. Most elementaries K through 6 saw a reduction, and then you can see at the 7th grade level, enrollments did increase from 7th grade through 12th grade. And as a result of a lot of the K5 or K4 age, those compulsory, enrollments, you'll see larger kindergarten enrollments now. And Mill Creek's the same. And I'll show that here shortly that we anticipate having a larger kindergarten class. The special education population continues to grow. If you look down here at the bottom, you could see from the 2009-10 school year all the way to the 2020-21 school year. In 2009-2010, it was 15.1% of your overall enrollment was special ed students. That is 18.1% in 2020-2021. As we had just talked about earlier today in the instructional, our currently is 18.5%. But you could see that exponential growth over the last decade. It's a 13.9% overall increase. Truancy rates have spiked during the pandemic. If you look down at the right-hand side, you can see the statewide truancy rates for 2020-21 as well as the year prior. They roughly doubled. There are numerous challenges that the districts face and that also still lie ahead. According to the survey, the largest challenge at 74.5% response was staffing shortages. We're currently experiencing that. We anticipate to experience that into the future. At 45.8% is relates to COVID challenges, 29.6% addressing academic regression, and 16.7% budget, next year's budget, as well as 11.9% related to providing consistent education. So those are some of the major challenges that districts across the state are experiencing. If you look at charter school costs, they're a primary budget pressure for a third consecutive year. If you look at the graph down at the bottom, you can see on the far left-hand side, that represents a 77.8%. The districts feel that charter school costs are going to be a large budget pressure for the upcoming school year. That's followed by 45.6% of districts feel that inadequate state funding is a large budget pressure. 31.9% feel that special education costs are a large budget pressure. You just saw the enrollment increase over the last decade. Those are mandated costs that are associated with that. And then as you consistently move down at 25.6 relates to the pension costs, and then 22.2% feel that construction and facility improvements is a large budget pressure for moving into the next year. So let's take a look a little bit about our funding overall. If you can look on the far left-hand side and what's in red is that shows the revenue by sources and then all districts across the state where 58.5% of their total revenue is locally driven, or 38.5% is state driven and 3% federally driven. And then it breaks it down by rural, urban, or suburban areas. So if we look at the far on the left-hand side, the red, down at the bottom right-hand side, a suburban district. These are districts that are comparable to Mill Creek. 69.2% of their budgets are generated locally, local revenue, followed by 29% state funded and 1.6 federally funded. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail here. So this is just a different way of showing that slide essentially, but this shows that if you look down, it's the state of Pennsylvania, every district in the state, all 500, the far left-hand side and the most green, or if you're 80% state funded, as you move to the darker red, that's 80% locally funded. So if you look up in the top left-hand corner of the state of Pennsylvania or Erie County, you can see Mill Creek is heavily locally funded as compared to all the surrounding districts. Pennsylvania is among the lowest in the state share of education funding. So if we look here on the left-hand side, it shows a percent of revenue from state sources, and it's ranking it up by state. Pennsylvania ranks 45, 37.9% of your revenue is state driven. And as you look at the US and all the states mapped out here, you can see that on how it compares, with the red being local funded and the blue being state funded. So the state of Pennsylvania relies heavily overall compared to most states on their local funding. Federal relief funds plans for this upcoming year. Again, this is all based off of the survey information. So if we look at the bottom left-hand side, school districts plans to spend federal relief funding, you can see that social emotional learning was 87%, followed by academic recovery or acceleration by 79.2%, safe in-person learning at 61.3%, facility upgrades at 57.6%, staff recruitment at 27.5%, and family and community partnerships at 19%. This slide shows essentially what the spending per student. What are those costs that are driving the total cost per student for all school districts statewide. You can look down at the graph there, it's 58.9% of the total cost per student is for instruction, direct instruction, followed by 9.5% relates to debt servicing and administrations at just under 8%. And you can see that as it's moving forward. The point of that slide is the majority of the spending for a school district relates to direct instruction for students. And that's roughly 60% of that overall cost. This slide shows it's showing your expenditures per student. If you look on the left-hand side here for what's in red, it ranks every state in the country and what the expenditures per students are. You can see Pennsylvania ranks number 8, 16,864,000. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see how high that is. That is rather high. The big factor here is out of that $16,864,000 per student, 5,485 or 32.5% of that total cost relates to pension contributions. So let's talk a little bit about more state mandated cost. As you look on the right-hand side here and within red, you can see the increase from 2010-11. The average cost per student was $12,559. In 1920, that cost increased to $16,577. It's roughly a little over $4,000 per student over the last decade, just under a decade. So if we look at the left-hand side at the bottom and you see this graph, and that shows you what's attributing to that $4,000 increase. Just over $2,000 of the increase over the last decade relates to pensions, pension cost. Charter schools are about $735, followed by salary increases of just under $600, and then other is at $662. If I'm reading that correctly. Growth in mandated expenses. As we look down here on the bottom left-hand graph here, it shows mandated expenses versus state and federal revenue from 2010-11 school year to the 1920 school year. Charter school cost, revenue decreased by $219 million over that time frame. Meanwhile, expenditures increased by $1,234 per, or $1,234, excuse me. If you look down at pensions, the exact same concept exists where just under $2 billion in received increase in pension subsidy. However, the expenditures increased by $3.5 billion. The state's share, and on the right-hand side, you can see that an overall increase just under $3 billion for all districts. However, the increase for the funding was only $480 million over a 10-year period. Point of this is the mandated expenditures are continuing to escalate. Meanwhile, the state funding is not increasing at the same rate. This will show a little bit more of our pension cost. The bottom left-hand graph shows what the pension contribution, the light pink line shows the employer contribution share for pension contributions, as well as once it turns into a darker pink color, that's the projected. And then the line below that, which is extremely dark, it shows a pension as a percentage of expenses. But you can see that we are plateauing. And actually for this upcoming school year, we expected 34.94%. It's going to be 34%. So we are at that plateau, but you could see what was experienced over the last 15 years. That employer share of pensions has drastically increased exponentially. I mean, so let's look at it about for the same type of graph, but mandated expense for charter schools. So the lighter color represents the charter school tuition paid. Meanwhile, the darker line represents the charter school enrollment. And this is for the last 10 years. You can see enrollment has increased, but it's rather plateauing. However, that gap between enrollment and the charter school cost itself is widening. And the last slide that I have that shows more mandated costs relates to special education expenses outpacing revenues. So if you look at that slide down below, again, it's from the 9-10 school year to the 19-20 school year. The red represents state and federal subsidies received. The green represents the direct cost for special education as well as the support services. And as you can see here, expenditures increased 61.5% over that time. Meanwhile, subsidies increased 4.4%. So the entire state, so Mill Creek's no different. The entire state has these mandated costs for which they are growing exponentially. Meanwhile, our state funding is not matching pace with that. And we'll go into Mill Creek's situation here now. Let's take a look at our revenue first. And where does our money come from? And how do we compare? So this is taking Mill Creek's actual 2021-22 audit information versus the state and local, and that's state average that we pulled from the AFRs, and the local average is Erie County. And the big two components here is look at the size of Mill Creek's budget compared to the average. What is that? Double, triple the size. In addition to that, you could see the local revenue dependence at 64.14% compared to the state local revenue dependence of 55.8, or even the local is even lower than that at 35.77. Mill Creek relies heavily on its local resources. We'll keep digging this a little bit deeper. So the next couple of slides that we're going to be going over, relates to comparable districts. And I think it's important for you to understand the criteria used to define those comparable districts. And that criteria relates to a free and reduced percent of 30 to 50%. Mill Creek's 41. Enrollment above 4,250, but below 8,250. Mill Creek 6,300. And then a total actual expense of over 95 million, but below 155 million, for which Mill Creek's 124 million. You can see here there's 11 districts. I outlined what they are: Armstrong District, Delaware Valley District, Hempfield School District, etc. And just keep in mind that these graphs do change year on and year out because as the district's demographics change, as will the comparable districts. So as we look through this, our total local revenue per student, our real estate taxes, earned income taxes, everything locally driven. This graph shows from 2012 to 2021. Mill Creek is red. Districts that are common to us, commonly funded, are in black. The IU average is in gray, and the state average is in green. And that concept will exist for the next couple of slides here. But as you can see, we generate less than the state average, as well as less than our comparable district average. However, we do generate more revenue than the IU5. If you look at it as a state as a whole, Mill Creek in 2021 ranked 198 out of 500 districts in terms of how much we generated from local revenue per student. Let's understand that a little bit more on why that is the case. And I think understanding our millage rate, we also have to understand the state funding formula as well as the equalized mill. We generate less local revenue per student. Why is that? Equalized mill, it's a standard millage calculated by dividing a school district's total taxes collected and remitted by its total market value as certified by the Pennsylvania State Tax Equalization Board. We can only control our local revenue. We can't control our state funding, and our state funding model is if you have the ability to raise money locally, you should, because you're not going to receive as much state money. So let's look at our equalized mill. And I think this is important because we're about to talk about tax rates right now. And that is the primary driver behind our local revenue itself. This is how our equalized mill is in comparison to our comparable districts. Mill Creek's there in red for the second lowest, substantially lower than the average. And again, summarize an equalized mill, it basically is everybody's market value is the same. Where does your tax rate stack? So we are very low in our comparable districts, meaning our tax rate is very low. Let's take a look at IU5. We're below average, but we're really close there. I mean, we're right in the middle. However, keep in mind, the IU5 receives much more state funding than we do, and we're forced to rely on our local resources much more heavily than this IU5 average. So what is the impact of not raising taxes? There's a compounding effect to this. This is a slide from BDO that they'd given us years ago, and I've thought about changing it to have more relevant data that is more updated, but the concept still exists. So if you look at the Mill Creek Township School District, and it goes, the columns are from the 9-10 school year, 10-11, and 11-12. You look at 9-10, the district didn't raise taxes. They could have at 4.09%. That means that in red, you see that there was lost revenue of 1.75 million. In the 10-11 school year, the district raised taxes 5.23%. The average was 2.68. That means that we were over by 1.1 million. And then 11-12 school year, no taxes were raised. The average in the area was at 2.64%, lost revenue of $1.2 million for a grand total over a 3-year period of 1.8. However, that isn't the entire amount lost because there's a compounding effect to that. So if you look at the bottom section of this and showing the compounding, it's the same concept of the raising taxes or not raising taxes, raise taxes and not raising taxes. You started off in 9-10 where you lost 1.7 million in revenue. 10-11, that makes it 740,000 lost revenue. 11-12, that's $2 million in lost revenue for a 3-year total of 4.5 million. So again, the purpose of this slide is just showing the compounding effect that if you don't raise taxes, you're actually missing out because it compounds year over year. So let's look at our tax rate. And this slide, I like this slide because we're trying to show our tax rate compared to inflation. And there's 2 inflationary measures that are presented up here. One's the consumer price index, and the other is the cost of living adjustment for Social Security. If you look at the graph, the millage rate increase since 2006 is in red, the CPI is in green, and COLA is in gray. So the point for this slide is you could see that we haven't been raising taxes and keeping up with inflation since that time period. To take a look at that in a little bit more detail is, since 2014, Mill Creek is 1.5% behind CPI and 6.3% behind COLA, which equates to a lost revenue of about $3.9 million annually. And to give a little bit more information on how the percentage increase, I showed that on the right-hand side from 2010 through 2022. And it's been rather balanced as you're working through there. There's years with 0, some 4%. There's a lot of years that are 2 or less. But that provides you a little bit more detail of what those percentages are year over year. So where is our tax rate overall, and how's that stack up against the IU5 average? Mill Creek's that blue. I know this is very difficult to see because there's 17 districts that are out there, but Mill Creek's blue. You could see that Mill Creek, in terms of where the tax rate is in relation to the IU5, is middle of the road. However, we're about to get in, and I'm hoping everybody has a little bit better understanding of our local funding because we're about to go into the state funding model here. And although our tax rate's middle of the road, we receive less state funding than most of these districts. And let's talk about that a little bit more why. So in order to understand our state funding, I think it's important to know what the market value aid ratio is, as well as the personal income aid ratio, and then those combined to making the market value personal income aid ratio. This is a factor that the state uses in determining subsidies. Your market value, as you can see up here, it's taking your total district market value, dividing it by the ADMs versus the state, essentially multiplying by 0.5. And then it's the same concept for the personal income, which is driven from your state tax returns. So long and short of this is the lower the aid ratio, the wealthier the state perceives the district to be. So let's look at their aid ratios. Mill Creek's again in red, common districts are black, and the IU5's gray. Mill Creek has a lower aid ratio. So again, the state perceived Mill Creek having the ability to generate revenue locally, less of a need for state assistance. And you could see that dip coming here on 2022. And I'll show another slide that shows that in a different way here shortly. So what does that mean in terms of the state subsidy? It's easy for me to stay here to say, hey, this ratio is low. We're not going to receive as much state funding. Let's look at it applied to our largest state subsidy received, which is the basic education funding formula right here. Long story short, if you look at the top, it shows the different weights that the state has based on a 3-year average ADM. But more importantly, if we look down at the bottom, you're looking at the MII and the LECI. Those are multiplied by those factors. So if we come down and we look at this a little bit further, is the MII stands for Medium Household Income Index and Local Effort Capacity Index, which essentially is market value of personal income aid ratio, as well as the equalized mill that we discussed. Those are factors amongst this. So if you're going to take it and we multiply 1 by 12 million, you're still going to be at 12 million. But if we have a higher index, if we're above average, essentially, which we're not, say it's 1.5 multiplied by 12 million, that's going to be 18 million, right? That's more. So the state actually even rewards you for keeping up with your local taxes in the state funding formula. Here's another example of this, that is the special education funding formula. If you look down at the bottom row here, your equalized millage multiplier and your market value personal income aid ratio. So those are just 2 examples, but those are what are driving this. As we look here, Mill Creek receives less state funding than all of our counterparts. To be exact, in 2021, we ranked 404 out of 500 districts. And that's because of the factors that I have just outlined in the last previous slides. We look at our total federal revenue, we rank 282 out of 500. And you can see everybody on the right-hand side from 2020 and 2021, that large upswing is all the federal relief funding that was received. So our total current revenue, we generate, our tax rate's rather low, we generate less revenue per student. And that way, overall, we're going to generate less revenue per student. And in turn, we're going to spend less per student, which we're going to show here in a minute. So our total ranking out of revenue per student is 435 out of 500 districts in 2021. So let's flip over to the expenditure side. In 2021, MTSD ranked 433 out of 500. Keep in mind, if we generate less money per student, we can't spend more. So we're going to be spending less per student as well. And that was in direct instruction. We look at our support services. We ranked 325 out of 500. We look at our total non-instructional, which is our extracurriculars. We rank 404 out of 500. And you could see that dip on 19, 20, and 21. That relates to the pandemic. Many extracurriculars didn't occur at that moment of time. So our total current expenditures per student ranks 425 out of 500 districts. 5 out of the 500 districts, excuse me. Again, I don't mean to continuously repeat this, but if you generate less revenue per student, you have to spend less per student. And then our total expenditures ranks 442 out of 500. The difference between the current and the total is your debt service. So let's look at our fund balance and compare to the IU5. If you look at the arrow, that's Mill Creek. And I tried to, those dots, because each column here represents a different district, those dots represent a percentage of expenditures. Your fund balance as a percentage of your expenditure. Mill Creek's at the lower side for the IU5 in terms of our fund balance in relation to our total expenditures. However, when you look at districts who are funded most comparable to us, Mill Creek's actually middle of the road. So let's take a look here real quick at our projection, enrollment projections. This is a trend for the last 10 years. You can see the bars represent from 2011 to 2022 in total enrollment. The red line, or the purple line represents our free and reduced number. The blue line represents our special education percentage of enrollment. And then the blue line at the bottom represents our MLL enrollment in terms of total enrollment here. And you can see, as we've been talking about, there's a dip that we recognize in the market value personal income aid ratio. Our free and reduced percentages are matching that. As you can see over the last 2 to 3 years, the increase of our special education population, which is no different than we've recognized at the state level, as well as the MLL population. Our total enrollment's been declining. That's anticipated. Erie County as a whole is declining, as well as the state of Pennsylvania. However, we do anticipate that decline to really steady, if not to increase a little bit over the next couple of years. We look at this, this slide shows our enrollments from preschool, each column from preschool all the way to 12th grade. I like to show this slide so you can see at each grade band where our enrollments really are. We see that big jump you see is at 7th grade. We have a lot of non-public students that come to the Mill Creek starting in 7th grade. That results in that big jump. You could see in kindergarten, this is last year's data, that it was a rather higher enrollment. We anticipate that again for this upcoming year. And then this slide just shows the percent change since 2008 to 2022. And you can see that's broken out from, if you're moving from columns left to right, kindergarten through 12th grade, with special education and our low income, the far right columns. And kindergarten's up in terms of percentage. Most of them are down, which we would anticipate, given that our overall enrollment's been declining. With that said, I'm going to move into our forecast of where we anticipate ending this current school year. This slide, I use this format. Again, you have it titled on the left-hand side, or where we ended 21-22 year, the 22-23 budget, where we forecast to be, the variance against the budget, and the percent variance with an explanation on the right-hand side. So we're looking at real estate taxes. We expect about a $246,000 surplus. That's 0.43% of the budget. That's primarily a result of increase in assessed values. As we move down, the next big change is our earned income tax. We expect about a 5.29% increase, which is about $456,000. That's wage growth that we're experiencing. We expect that to continue into the future. We'll take advantage of that increase in this upcoming budget. Real estate transfer tax, we expect to level off. Our delinquent real estate tax, we have we're expecting a $269,000 surplus, 22.4%. That's primarily driven that we didn't waive the penalty this year. The last couple of years we waived that penalty, the 10% penalty. And then the big one out of all of this is we can look at our earnings on investment. In 21-22, we had $74,000 that was recognized. Right now we're forecasting at 1.4 million. The Federal Reserve continues to move that rate. And as they do, we've been trying to capitalize, and we'll only capitalize on that further with the investment plan that we hope to have approved at the COW this evening. It's important to recognize what that revenue is. When we get into our fund balance side of that, is that investment income is earmarked. And we'll talk about that further. So if we look at our state revenue, we'll start with our basic ed form subsidy. We did have an increase in state allocation, just under 1.1 million more than what we were anticipating. And that also was an increase in our special education of $264,000 from what we were expecting. So when you look in total, our state revenue, we anticipate to be about just under $2 million more than our budget, or 5.71%. We look at our federal revenue. This is always, this is all over the place a little bit here because a lot of this relates to the federal relief funding, the ESSER funds that we've received and how we've been spending them thus far. Again, as a reminder, that report's available on a monthly basis and posted on our website of what we have spent our funds on. But that's the primary driver here, and the federal revenue being about $1.6 million over budget. 1.3 of that or so, it relates to our federal funding. And then you also have 536,000. We did sell MLC, and we were anticipating doing that last year when we developed the budget. So if we look at this, this is just a column graph here over for those 3 data points. The increases year over year. 63% of our total where we anticipate ending is locally driven, followed with 30.11 being state funding, and then 6.66% being federally driven for our total revenue. So let's flip over to the expenditure side. We can look at our salaries as we're moving down through here. I'll focus on the material line items here. Our teachers, we are expecting about an $830,000 surplus, which will be offset by our long-term subs, which is a $132,000 deficit. I mean, right now we have 29 open positions on leaves. We removed a Sarah Reed position. We had some ESY savings that we didn't expect. We didn't replace a position, but when you have that many openings, it does result in a savings at the end of the day. For totally, when we go down at the bottom, we expect about $451,000 surplus compared to our savings compared to where we expected to end, which is about a little less than 1%. As we talked about staffing shortages, we consistently are having that and the timing of replacing. So for this upcoming budget, we will be much more aggressive in our salaries in order to recognize those struggles. Benefits. In grand total, you're looking at our healthcare. We're 6% over budget for where we anticipate being. We're self-funded. It is as the claims come in. We were trending really well, and that's our projection for the rest of the year. So our total benefits, we expect to be just under $500,000 over budget, or 1.5%. We look at our other expenses. Our total contracted services are expected to be over our budget about just under $1 million. As you can look on the right-hand side, that's attributable to our increase in our sub rates. I think we did it twice this year, and that much more than what we anticipated in the budget. Mental health contract, we have some manufacturing grants in there. We look at property services, there's $752,000 savings here. That's offset when you go down to the debt and capital projects transfer. GASB 87 requires us to recognize those expenditures differently. Therefore, you see those two should really be netted out together. We do have we're anticipating $515,000 savings in our transportation. We've been short drivers all year long, minimum 5. That comes at a savings. We're struggling to find drivers. We're working towards trying to resolve that. Equipment, $760,000 over from where we anticipated. That is the IT equipment purchase that we use ESSER's funding for. And then overall, when you look down here at the $2.1 million debt capital projects transfer, that relates to GASB 87. I'm just trying to recognize the Walnut Creek HVAC. We recognize the revenue because that is ESSER funded. We have to recognize the expense as well. And then the sale of MLC, we will transfer over to our capital projects fund. So you're looking at a total deficit of about 2.6 million, or just under 8%. So what's that look like? Again, it's bar graph. You can see our expenditures climb from last year of 114.5 million to 117.5 million. We're forecasted for the forecasted expenditure amount. 68% relates to salaries and benefits, with the offsetting 32% in other. So what's that look like in total of funding our net, where we're gonna end? As we climb up this waterfall here, 74.8 million in local revenue, 35.6 state revenue, 7.8 in federal revenue, offset by 80.3 million in salaries and benefits, 37.3 other expenses. We anticipate ending with a $796,000 surplus. However, there's a little, as I mentioned, that investment income was earmarked. This is what it will look like for our fund balance. As you look across, you have your unassigned fund balance, our non-spendable fund balance, capital projects committed, assigned for salaries and benefits, and assigned for IT. Now, keep in mind, last year we did use all of our assigned fund balance that we had, which was roughly $3.3 million set aside for the VOTEC and making those payments related to that renovation. So 2021 or 21-22 ties exactly to our audit for a total of 25.3. But as I mentioned, that investment income and as well the participation fees, the gate receipts are all earmarked for extracurricular facilities. Our investment income is earmarked 25% for capital projects transfer, 25% for our extracurricular committed fund balance, 25% for salaries, and 25% for IT. And you could see the increases here. So if we look on the far left-hand side, we get to, and then we're projecting to spend about $1 million of our fund balance in our capital projects. So $1 million negative with $800,000 positive surplus gets you the net of 202. But at the end of the day, this is what it shuffles around to being. Our unassigned fund balance is going to have a negative 802,000. Expect to be about 7.8 million. Our capital projects, we expect to use $1 million. We anticipated this, especially with the security project that was going forward. We knew we were going to be using some of this funding. Our committed fund balance is going to add just under 600,000 to be about 2.5 million. Our assigned salaries and benefits is addition of 677,000, about 3.9 or 3.9 million. Assigned for IT, 338. It gets us to our end result of our fund balance being reduced by just under 200,000. Our total expenditures for last fiscal year were about 114 million. Following this does mean that we're going to be out of compliance with policy in regards to our unassigned fund balance being 8% of our expenditures. With that said, that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. And our timeline is next month, we'll present our actual budget for the 23-24 fiscal year. April, we'll ask for approved preliminary budget, and May will be the approved final budget. Any questions?
Mr. Toole, if I remember correctly, our projected 23 budget was going to be a $2.1 million deficit. We're seeing roughly almost a $3 million swing.
That's correct. And that's shown in all of these slides, what the differences are. I mean, when you're looking at that 3 million, 1.4 of that relates to investment already. We're struggling for staffing. That was what, another $500,000. In turn, when you have savings and staffing, you're going to have savings and pension contributions and Social Security, Medicare tax. We're short drivers. That was another $500,000. But just off the top of my head, I rattled off quite a bit. That's offset by some other funding, right?
I think you do a very good job of explaining very complicated stuff to people who aren't well versed in finance. I think it's a very valuable presentation for someone that's upset about their taxes going up. It really explains why they have to go up, because the federal and state government money that we're getting is not keeping up with what we need. So I think there were a lot of good things in the presentation.
Thank you.
I would echo those same comments. I appreciate the time and effort that went into the presentation. Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no other questions. I appreciate the time and effort put into that. I know that's a big team lift. It's not just you, so appreciate the rest of the people behind you that helped to get that document to us. So thank them as well.
Will do. Thank you.
You have 10 additional slides.
I cut a lot of slides out of here because I had a lot of other things I wanted, but I thought it was long enough.
Fairness, it was 80. I asked him to pare down a little.
Thanks, Aaron.
Now they
Thank
can't
you.
complain about the instruction committee going too long.
No doubt.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.